welcome to another episode of Zilog and Moto, the channel that has more Sega reviews than you can shake a sufficiently large stick at. Seriously, don't try it, you'll just injure yourself. I'm your host Dave, and this is my collection, of which I'll be going through and attempting to review one of these titles each and every week. What does my collection consist of? Well, to be honest, I've been a gamer since I was very young, starting out with the Atari 2600 and the Commodore 64, and then later on moving to the Sega Genesis. And I didn't stop playing games then either, so in reality, if you're talking about my entire collection, I've got titles for the PlayStation 1 through 4, all flavors of Xbox, the GameCube, the Saturn, just a lot of games that interest me that I've picked up over the years. But specifically for this channel, I decided to do something that was a bit more targeted, more focused. About 5 years back, I had started to try to collect for the Master System and the Genesis. The Master System because it was a console that I was always curious about, despite never owning, and the Genesis, which had decidedly been my favorite console growing up. And that was going well, picking up titles here and there, and then it happened. I found myself at the Midwest Gaming Classic in Milwaukee, walking around the various vendors that were under the outdoor tent, as that was during the weird time when the convention had grown too big for it to fit into the Hilton, so it was literally bursting at the seams out into the parking lot. Anyway, I happened to spot a Model 1 Genesis with a Model 1 Sega CD all hooked up and ready to go. I'd always wanted a Model 1 as that's what my friends had growing up, and I know it's got reliability issues compared to the Model 2, but come on, this just looks better than this. I picked it up right then and there and found a copy of Final Fight from a different vendor, and it was off to the races. This had opened up the door to start collecting for the Sega CD as well, and the 32X wasn't far behind it. If I could play it on a Genesis via some sort of adapter, I wanted it. Good, bad, or mediocre. But that wasn't the end of it. Oh, no. About the same time, I also discovered Retro Gamer at my local Barnes & Noble. In that particular issue, I saw right up for a game that I'd never heard of before called Master of Darkness, which is a great Castlevania-style game for the Master System. And it just made me think just how many games was I not aware of because they were either exclusive to Europe or Brazil. Turns out, it's a lot, especially in regards to the Master System. This was the final piece of the collecting puzzle for me, as now not only did I want to collect for the Master System, Genesis, Sega CD, and 32X, but I wanted all the English language games, no matter whether they came from. And thus, Zilog and Moto was born, with the goal of collecting these 1,275 games, give or take a few, and performing in-depth reviews on each of them. If that sounds interesting to you, I recommend you subscribe, and I'll be back each week with a new game from this collection. Having said all that, with the goal being to collect and review all these titles, that's going to lead to some situations like this week, where I'm reviewing a game that it could be argued that I've already done before. Back in episode 34, I reviewed Jeopardy for the Genesis, based on the game show of the same name. Well, Jeopardy would have two other games released based on it, Jeopardy Deluxe Edition and Jeopardy Sports Edition, and today I'm looking at the former of those two. I gave the original Jeopardy 2 stars in that previous episode, as while it wasn't anything special, it was a functional home version of the game show. Has anything changed in just over a year since the original game was released? Or am I really playing the exact same game with different questions? Well, we'll see, but first a look at the package. And this is my copy of Jeopardy Deluxe Edition. And it's just an okay shape, and I'm fine with that, as this isn't exactly a highly sought-after title. The outer shell is held up for the most part, minus a chunk missing from the rear bottom corner. I'm assuming it was dropped at some point. And the hang tab has been removed from the top of the case, but at least this time it was properly surgically removed, as opposed to some of the hack jobs I've seen recently. The rest of the outer cover is held up well with no scratching, and the inner cover is fully intact with no water damage or sun bleaching, and no edge wear, meaning it never slipped out of place and was slid back incorrectly. One of the first things I'll point out with the cover is that this period of 1993-1994 was when Sega had switched over from their old style of cover art. With the original Jeopardy coming out in early 1993, it was still from the era where third-party developers had more free reign to do what they wanted to do with the cover art. Hence why you see the art on the original game's cover art taking up most of the surface
on the front, sitting on top of a plain black background that matched up reasonably close with Sega's own first-party black box releases, minus the cross-hatching. However, by the time Jeopardy Deluxe Edition was released in mid-1994, Sega had moved on to the color-coded vertical band name formatting on their releases, which reduced the amount of space that designers had to work with, resulting in a much smaller picture of Alex Trebek and the Jeopardy set being used. And at first you might think it's a totally different picture, with the shot of Alex obviously being newer, but if you look very closely, you can see that the background image of the set is actually the same on both covers. It's just zoomed further out on the deluxe cover. There's two other differences between the covers, with the first being that you can see another reason for why the picture used was so much smaller, and that's the inclusion of Sega's totally unnecessary GAVRC rating in the bottom corner. Like, really, Sega, thanks for letting me know that a game show that was 30 years old at that point was safe for kids. That's totally worth blocking out the cover art for. Beyond that, there's also this round sticker exclaiming All New 94 Edition. Now, this sticker doesn't actually cover anything, it's just sort of there, which begs the question why? Why go through the trouble of putting a sticker on the cover insert after production if you don't need to cover up incorrect information? My only guess is that after this cover was approved for production, someone in management saw it and compared it to the original game and decided, that deluxe isn't descriptive enough, we need to put something on here so that everyone knows that this game is different and it's okay to buy both of them. Flipping over the back, there's not much to point out here. There's 4 good quality screenshots, with the second one especially almost looking a bit too good, and then there's some standard flavor text selling the game that's not copied over from the original. About the only thing that really stands out to me is the use of the 1 to 3 player logo, which was not used for the original game, possibly because it didn't exist at that point, even though it plays in the same manner. In fact, it makes me wonder if this is the only game to use that 1 to 3 player logo. I certainly can't think of another candidate that might possibly do it. Opening the case up, and while the cartridge looks great, the manual is unfortunately a little bent on the end, and the inner leaf has come loose. The reason for this is that the staples are totally missing. Just completely gone. With the holes being present, it almost appears to be a manufacturing defect, but I suppose the previous owner could have removed them? Anyway, the manual itself is fine, albeit a bit wordy, and there was at least some small screenshots included to break up the text. Okay, that's way too much about the package. Let's get to the game and see what GameTech is bringing to the table this time around. So let's just get this out of the way in the beginning of the review. Yes, I technically have already reviewed this game. Sort of. Previously on Zilog and Moto, I already reviewed several games that could be considered the same game twice. For titles where there's a Master System version versus a Genesis version, I don't really have an issue with reviewing the game twice, as usually there's a fairly large difference between 8 and 16-bit titles, even for older arcade titles. Where things get to be problematic is reviewing a game that appeared on both the Genesis and the Sega CD, or the Genesis and the 32X. This has been something I've dealt with previously in reviewing the Genesis and Sega CD versions of Cliffhanger, Three Ninjas Kick Back, and Bill Walsh College Football. In each of those titles, while the base game was unchanged, there were at least things that were added to the game which gave me something to talk about in comparing the two, and in the case of Cliffhanger, loudly complaining about those damn snowboarding sequences. With Jeopardy and Jeopardy Deluxe, however, it appears I'm heading into new territory of having to reinvent the wheel, so to speak. As mentioned earlier in episode 34, during the first year of Zilog and Moto, I reviewed the original Jeopardy game that released in early 1993 for the Genesis. Today's game, Jeopardy Deluxe Edition, was released a little over a year later, and on the surface, not a whole lot has changed. Sure, the game got some partially new cover art, but if you were a parent and not really paying attention, I could definitely see how someone could confuse this game with the previous release. The Deluxe Edition label is just kind of tucked into the title logo, and the picture with Alex Trebek is very close to what was on the original release. And I think GameTech realized that, or it was pointed out to them by major distributors like Toys R Us and Electronics Boutique, which is why that big white sticker was placed on the cover, to let parents know, or to give kids something to bug their parents about, that this was indeed a new release, despite any visual similarities between the two. However, just how new a release the game is somewhat debatable, In doing research on the game, I came across postings on the internet that indicated it was the exact same game, simply with different questions to answer during gameplay. Specifically, on the Sega Retro listing for the game, there's a statement that the game, quote, looks, sounds, and plays exactly like the regular Jeopardy! Mega Drive game, to the point that Deluxe Edition does not appear anywhere. So, that's obviously not a good sign for me going into this review. But is the game actually a complete carbon copy of the original game, just with different questions? And what does this mean for me when I have to eventually review Jeopardy! Sports Edition, which was released about the same time as this Deluxe Edition? Well, the Sports Edition quandary is thankfully a problem for another day, tentatively scheduled for 2 years from now, so plenty of time to figure that out, what I'm going to do there. Maybe for that one I'll break down and just cut and paste the previous segments, who knows? For now though, let's break down what hasn't changed from the original Jeopardy! Release to this Deluxe Edition. As mentioned in the Sega Retro listing, when booting up the game for the first time, if you have played the original game, you'll see an eerily similar sight. Jeopardy! Deluxe features the exact same introduction. The first thing you'll see is a slightly darker blue Sega logo than normal, and then the GameTech logo, then the Park Place Productions logo, and finally the exact same Jeopardy! Screen showing what appears to be a digitized version of the Jeopardy! Set. In this regard, Sega Retro is correct, and bizarrely, or perhaps just incredibly lazily, there's no indication on the title screen that Jeopardy! Deluxe Edition is in any way different than the original Jeopardy! Release. Once you get past the intro screens, you're then presented with the exact same game setup process, whereby you select the amount of players you want to have in the game, how many computer players you'll be playing against, if any, and then the choice of which avatar your character will have, the name entry for that character, or no entry at all if you screw up and hit the C button instead of the A button when trying to enter your name like I did the first time, and then finally a screen which visually allows you to pick the buzz-in button for that character. If you weren't paying close attention, you wouldn't notice the only difference that I was able to pick up on, besides the obvious new sets of questions and categories, and that would be the players' avatars have been updated with 5 new characters to choose from, and that Alex's design has been updated as well. While the avatars certainly are nothing special graphically, they have been improved from the simpler designs that were used in the original game, which had facial features that you could barely make out. It's a very small detail, but one of the little touches that the original game had was that your avatar would react based on whether you answered a question correctly or not. But due to how little detail there was in their face, it was very hard to see the change in expression, and honestly, I don't know if you'd be able to on a smaller old-school TV. With the new character designs, it's now much easier to see that reaction, and the characters do just generally look better, which is a good thing, since you spend half the game looking at them. This applies to Alex as well, however, but in his case, you would be forgiven for not noticing because he is almost never on the screen, only appearing when no one is able to answer a question correctly. As far as everything else goes, well, if you saw my review of the original game, you can probably skip the next few minutes, as I don't think I'll be covering any new ground. But for those of you that didn't see it, or like me, have totally forgotten what I said because it happened more than a few days ago, I'll run through the basics again. If you're not familiar with the game show that these games are based off of, then you've probably been super confused by the last 10 minutes or so, but Jeopardy! The game show dates back to March 30th, 1964 in its original incarnation. However, the version of the show that Jeopardy! Deluxe Edition is based off of began 20 years later, on September 10th, 1984, and has run ever since, hosted the majority of that time by Alex Trebek until his death in late 2020. Jeopardy! Is a fairly conventional quiz show where 3 players compete to answer questions for dollars in 2 rounds, with each round featuring 5 questions in 6 categories, that change per round, before getting to a one-off final Jeopardy! Question where the players have to wager a dollar amount for the question based only off of a given category, with the caveat being if they get it wrong, they lose that dollar amount, hence the name of the game, Jeopardy! From a structural perspective, Jeopardy! Deluxe Edition gets all that right. The intro is a shot of the Jeopardy! Stage with Johnny Gilbert, the announcer, saying, "This is Jeopardy!" as he does at the beginning of every episode, and then the traditional theme music for the show starts to play, or at least a decent interpretation of the theme music. You then choose how many players are going to play, including a 3-player option to match up with the show. I like that they included this, as they could have easily just limited it to 2 players, but keep in mind the game doesn't support either the Genesis 4-player controller adapters, so if you do play a 3-player game, 2 of the 3 players will have to share a controller, with each picking a button on that controller as their buzzer. One of the problems with converting a game show to a video game, at least one that's a quiz or puzzle based, is making sure there's enough questions included in the game so that you won't see all of them too quickly, as it spoils things a bit if you already know the answers from a previous game. And this is one of the purposes of a release like Jeopardy Deluxe, in giving players access to a new set of questions, if they had worn out the ones that came with the original game. However, just like my experience with the first game, I have to wonder about how those categories are handed out. The problem is it seems like each of the 6 categories per round is picked at random. You might think that picking 6 categories from 700 plus is a good thing, but in reality what happens is, very early you start to get categories that you've seen before. For example, I played 2 games to capture the footage for this video, and in just those 2 games I had a repeated category. The game provides you with the option to repick the categories if you've seen ones you've had before at the beginning of a round, which is good, but it would have been less frustrating had Park Place Productions had simply linked the 6 categories together, so that either you had seen the whole board before or none of it, rather than rolling the dice and hoping the computer picks 6 new ones. At the end of the day though, Jeopardy Deluxe is a competent video game version of the TV show, and if you're at all interested in matching your wits against some friends of the computer, it gets the job done. I would have liked to have seen improved graphics or perhaps some more sound effects, but Game Tech felt like it was good enough to just keep the same basic framework and make some more money. And there's some odd bugs, like a delay in switching between avatars when you're picking a character at the beginning of the game, and some questions where the screen runs out of room, so you have to guess what's missing. Those really should have been fixed in QA for a game this simple, especially for a game that's essentially a rehash of a previous title. But the name of the game is Jeopardy, and that's what Jeopardy Deluxe is, for better or worse. And even though it's essentially the same game as the original, just a year later, I'm still going to give it the same rating of that original game, 2 stars. It certainly could have been a lot better, but it's functional and not frustrating, and in the video game world, that counts for a lot.
And that's it for Jeopardy Deluxe Edition. If you happen to get to this point of the video, you definitely deserve one of Stan Lee's no prizes, as I'm sure a review to a bare-bones sequel of a borderline budget release is not the most exciting thing in the world, but hopefully there was still some valuable information in there for those that care about that sort of thing. Fair warning, as mentioned earlier, I am going to be reviewing Jeopardy Sports Edition down the line as well, so no fair complaining when I get to it in a few years. Just be glad you aren't the ones doing the work. Next week on Zilog and Moto, it is not a sequel. At least, not really, even though I'm sure there's some people out there that might consider it one. It's also a game that I've never played, either the home version or in the arcades, mainly because I don't know if I've ever seen the arcade version of the machine. I mean, Galloping Ghost has it, because they have everything, but I must have missed it when I was out there before. Regardless, I'm looking forward to giving it a shot next week, as it'll probably be the last Sega CD review I post this year, and while the game that it's not a sequel of had some frustrating parts, I enjoyed playing it for its review. Please remember to subscribe if you like this video, and remember, whatever you like to play, have fun, and be excellent to each other. Later.